everyone. You're all very welcome to today's Client Experience webinar on managing data and cyber breaches. As you know, the focus of our Client Experience program is on providing you with insights on the issues that matter most to you and your team. With cyber attacks and data breaches getting more complex and hitting our headlines more frequently, sharing that experience and insight is very much at the core of our session today. As always, the session is about you. So we'd love if you have questions along the way, pop them in the chat. You're more than welcome to get involved. We'd really love if you took the opportunity to get the most of the session. And if your environment allows as well, do turn on your camera and say hello. I'm very excited to introduce you and pass you over to my colleague, Antonis Patrikios, co-chair of Denton's Global Privacy and Cybersecurity Group, who will introduce you to our team today and lead you through the session. We hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Hi, everyone. As Niamh said, it's Antonis here, a data privacy and cybersecurity partner based in London. I will be leading today's session, and I'm very pleased to have with me three of my great colleagues in our global privacy and cybersecurity group, with whom we work very often together on cyber and data breach matters, whether it is getting clients ready for incidents when they happened, or actually working with them, working our way through breaches when they actually occur. So I will now pass to my colleagues to introduce themselves in order of appearance in the gallery. Robin, why don't you go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Robin Chatwood. I'm from Melbourne in Australia, and I'm a privacy cybersecurity partner here. So I've been working in Denton's Australia for about 5 years, but before that I was about 7 years in London with the fine technology team over there. So I'm co-lead of the privacy and cybersecurity practice in Australia and lead of the technology practice.
Thank you, Robin. Alison?
Thanks so much. I'm a privacy and cybersecurity partner in our Washington, D.C. office. I spent nearly a decade in the U.S. government working on a variety of issues, including serving as a senior cybersecurity counsel for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In private practice, I help companies with both preparedness and response, mainly for cybersecurity issues and general risk and crisis management issues associated with data and technology. So great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And last but not least, Ken.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, it's everyone. So I'm Ken Dai. I'm based in Shanghai. So I'm one of the leading data protection lawyer within Denton, China. So I led the team advise the client, in particular the multinational company, on the area aspect of data protection, including cybersecurity. So it's happy to share some view is from China side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, team. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we will cover 4 hot topics of incident response, namely risk and why is incident response so important in a risk management sense. Second topic is responding to incidents and how we should be approaching response in practice. The third is preparedness, what we should be doing in advance of an incident in order to optimize our incident response. And then finally, stakeholder management, with a particular focus on how we should be engaging with the C-suite and the board. So in the course of the next 50 minutes or so, the Denton's team will provide you insights from our global practice in the form of an informal conversation. I think most of you will be pleased to know that we don't have many slides. Actually, you've seen most of the slides already. So it's going to be an informal chat, but we also want this to be interactive. We want to hear from you in relation to your experience, your concerns, and what keeps you up at night. So interactivity will take place in 2 ways. First, for each topic that we will cover, we will run a survey. We ask you to please participate, and we'll encourage you to participate in the survey. And then the Denton's team will discuss the results as we go along. The survey is anonymous. And of course, in addition to the survey, you will have the opportunity to provide comments or ask questions in the usual ways, i.e. in the chat room as we go along. And of course, we'll try to leave some time in the end for some Q&A if you still have the appetite to ask questions. The final point is, please note that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be circulated to you and will be made available on the website. So without further ado, let's turn to our first topic, risk and why is incident response so important. Judith, if we can bring up the first survey, please. So I hope everyone can see the survey. What is the most significant concern regarding cyber data security and the risk of breaches? What keeps you up at night? Is it loss of data? Is it system unavailability and disruption that a serious breach might cause? Is it the regulatory fines, the litigation risk, or is it the impact on your brand and reputation? If you can please tell us what we think, and as you're voting, we're going to let you know when we're about to close the survey. And as you're voting, let's start our discussion. Robin, if I may start with you. Thinking about the risk vector here, what do you think is the risk vector that poses the greatest risk to our clients? And which one do you see more commonly in your practice?
Sure, thanks for the question. Look, I think one of the greatest risks that we're seeing at the moment is ransomware. You know, I was reading some stats from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre the other day, and it was showing that ransomware attacks have increased by 500% since the start of the pandemic. And so this seems like it's just an unstoppable beast at the moment. So that's probably the greatest risk that we're seeing. Certainly cybercrime is on the rise. The other thing that I'm also seeing starting to feature is, you know, just exploiting poor patch management techniques. So, you know, what we're noticing is that, you know, the cyber criminals are getting so sophisticated, they're deploying artificial intelligence. So as soon as there's a system vulnerability that's been published or, you know, publicized somehow, including on the dark web, they're developing the tools that then actually go out into the ether, figure out who hasn't implemented that patch, and then exploiting that, and cybersecurity hacks are happening that way. So they're the sorts of things that I'm seeing on the rise.
So unsurprisingly, ransomware number one, poor security practices, lack of patching, etc., is number two. Alison, does your experience confirm the same?
Certainly, ransomware is a significant issue, and I do think that cybercrime continues to be on the rise. Two areas that I think are growing areas of concern are intellectual property theft, which can in some cases require sophistication, particularly from external actors, but has become especially common with bad leavers, whether that's during the pandemic and quite a bit of movement with work from home employees or otherwise. And I think we're likely to continue to see that, especially with the churn that's been related to economic conditions, and especially in the tech sector. On the other end of the spectrum, very low tech, is business email compromise. Threat actors who are seeking to redirect vendor invoice payments, payroll, retirement account contributions, even payments from the government, Medicaid, Medicare in the United States. So I think all of those things, including ransomware, which is a continuing and significant threat vector, are likely to be what we see most often in 2023.
Thank you. And Ken, I will bring you in shortly, but before we do, I think everyone in the audience, if you haven't voted on the poll, please do so now. I think we have a very clear steer here from you as to what you consider to be the biggest risk. Judith, can we close the survey, please, and bring up the results so that everyone can see them? So a very clear preference for the impact on brand and reputation, as opposed to, for example, the risk of fines and litigation risk. I think it's impressive that between them, a very small percentage of your overall concern. And then the distant second is the actual loss of data. I suspect you mean loss of personal data, but also to build on Alison's point, the loss of intellectual property or other confidential or market sensitive information. So that's very interesting, confirms our understanding, and also is entirely consistent with what our colleagues told us in the first session that we run. Ken will come to you very shortly, but Alison and Robin, very, very quickly, is there anything in the results of this survey that surprises you, or is it as you expected it to be?
Well, I guess it doesn't surprise me, with the exception of the litigation risk. I'm certainly seeing that that's more prominent now in Australia than it was. And I'm interpreting that category there as also the threat of class actions, against the directors for, poor data management practices. That's starting to become a feature on the landscape now.
Alison, something tells me you'll agree with that.
Very much so. The United States tends to be very litigious, and that's always a key risk that we see in disclosures and in other risk evaluations. So 5% top concern being litigation risk. Maybe that's the US audience raising their hands there.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much, both. So Ken, I'm turning to you now. And my question to you is, I would imagine these concerns are valid in China as well. But especially bearing in mind that the majority of our audience comes from the Western hemisphere, are there any additional risks in China? Are there any hidden risks that perhaps will not be obvious to all of us and are not in the survey?
Yeah, sure. It's Antonio. So from my side, I want to add is from the China law's perspective. One is the impact on other regulatory compliance procedure. For example, the cross-border data transfer. If you have the data breach, maybe impact on your apply for the data cross-border transfer security assessment and notification. That's one way special in China. I also want to add is another point is and maybe relating to some is Western companies subsidiary in China is the impact on certain corporate significant corporate action like M&A, even IPO. If you have some M&A and even IPO, such data breach will definitely on the whole schedule of such corporate significant action. Thank you.
So Ken, so what is, I think, the key point you're making here is that if you suffer a breach, you will have to deal with all these points that we're all used to. But in addition, you will have to notify many regulators, you will have to inform the authorities when you make applications to export your data. And I think the practical point is that having suffered a serious breach may complicate all these activities in China. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. So as you know, in China, we does not have the United DPA. So we have maybe more than 10 DPA authorities. So the first step or the technical difficulty is to identify which authority should be go to firstly. And at the same time, in maybe you have to analyze more than one authority to make an application. That with sometimes is a headache for the multinational headquarter in-house counsel.
Thank you, Ken. You have almost as many data protection authorities as Germany has, which has around 18, but thank you very much for these valuable insights. Robin, Alison, anything to add on what Ken said, or shall we move on to our next topic?
No, nothing from me. The only thing, it's interesting that, Ken was talking about the impact on, other processes. So, for example, if you wanted to list or, you had sort of a merger activity, I think that that's not uncommon in Australia to just as part of this brand or reputation management. Not only may you lose customers and things like that, but you'll also have impact from other service providers. So it could be triggering, clauses in contracts and obligations that you've got to notify other suppliers, you've had this sort of problem, and that might impact your contractual arrangements as well as, your legal obligations that are triggered under indemnities and all sorts of things like that. So, there is that risk as well. And it gets more complex the more data flows that you see internationally.
Thank you, Robin. Alison, any final thoughts on this?
Well said, I think, by both Ken and Robin.
Right. So just to summarize the key point from this topic, I think it is that sooner or later, every organization will suffer a serious breach, potentially with very significant consequences. Most of us seem to think that over and above the fines and the litigation and all that wonderful legal risk, it is actually the impact on the brand and the reputation of the business that's our biggest concern. And if that's the case, then surely this must place even more significance on how we deal with incidents when they happen, because clearly this will have an impact on our reputation. So we'll now move to a second point. But again, everyone in the audience, I would encourage you, if you have experiences to share or questions to ask, please put them in the chat and the Dentons team will do its best to answer them. So moving on to our second topic, response and how we should be approaching incident response in practice. Judith, if we can bring up the second survey, please. Okay, thank you very much. So our second survey for our participants to vote, what do you feel is the most difficult and complex aspect of responding to an incident or data breach? Is it knowing what to do, who is doing what, and what you are expected to do? Is it knowing who to turn for help externally, your lawyers, your forensics or PR vendors? Is it knowing who we need to notify, regulators, data subjects, customers, where, when, and how? Is it managing the incident across multiple jurisdictions and time zones with all the complexities that this might entail? Or is it managing internal stakeholders? Please tell us what you think, and as you're voting, we will address some of the practical questions. So, Alison, if I may start with you, please. So leaving aside legal and regulatory requirements here, right? What are the practical and operational difficulties of incident response, and what are the considerations that may make all the difference in practice?
Sure. So I think with incident response, once a set of facts have been identified that, is more than an event, it's been determined to be an incident. One of the key things, at least in the United States, is privilege. And that becomes much more complex when the incident affects cross-border users, technology, or customers. Not all jurisdictions share kind of the common law approach to assertion and maintenance of privilege. And so how you organize the response effort and the disclosure of information with teams, with stakeholders in jurisdictions that have different requirements regarding assertion of privilege or may not have really privilege at all, really can complicate that response effort. So I'd say that's the first thing. Second thing is managing disclosures with such different requirements for notifications. 6 hours in India under the new CERT requirement, 36 hours potentially if you're a bank in the US, 72 hours GDPR without undue delay in some jurisdictions in the US. What
24 hours in South Korea, and so on and so forth.
Yes, exactly. I mean, hopefully we'll not be down to minutes anytime soon, but it seems to be getting shorter and shorter. What you disclose when and to whom, how you issue those corrections, and what information you're required to disclose across all those jurisdictions will vary. So that's a key thing that we think about as well in terms of managing privilege and also the response itself.
Thank you, Alison. So privilege with all its nuances, point number one. How do you manage this operationally? And then second, just very practical things. How do you coordinate these notifications globally in a way that makes sense and of course ensures consistency of message? Robin, anything to add on that point from your experience?
Yeah, I think the other thing that makes it more difficult and complex is, the fact that, there's so much of business is global nowadays, and, people have very complex organizations, including complex service providers arrangements. And so you may not always be in control of getting the information. The breach could have happened with one of your service providers, and then they are the ones that have then consequently caused you to breach the law. And you're trying to gather the information from them. You're trying to do it at pace. You're trying to be accurate. You don't want to mislead, including misleading, regulators and data subjects. And the landscape is changing, as you're trying to get to the bottom of things. And then your stakeholder group not just includes those, but, possibly cyber insurers, and they want to take control of things and control how you do what, when and who, because they've got their patch that they're looking after as well. And so it just gets very complicated with all of these different stakeholder groups, trying to gather the relevant information and then what you say to the public. and to data subjects about that. So I do think it is, in international business nowadays in particular, it's getting very complex.
Thank you. And I think I like just trying to bring out the common threads from what the two of you covered. It's all about managing information, isn't it? Whether you think about the disclosability of information, whether it is about how we disclose it in the context of regulatory notifications, or turning this on its head, Robin, how we obtain information when it's a third party in the supply chain that caused the breach. All that linked together, and how you manage this in practice is really, really important. If we can bring the results of the poll, I think our colleagues have given us, again, immediate answers, although not entirely clear. It's neck and neck, really, in terms of what is the most difficult and complex aspect of responding to a breach. So it's neck and neck between the complexity of notifications, the notifications nightmare, as I like to call it, and then the practicalities of managing incidents across borders and time zones and what this entails. And Ken, I'll come to you very shortly around this. But I think one good point around these two things, if between them, they constitute 60% of your worries around incident response, I think what our experience tells us is that, of course, there's never perfection, but having done so many of those in the course of the years, gradually you start developing the know-how, the tools, the simple tools like templates and forms, and easy ways of translating in order to make submissions that can help you in practice. And much of it can be tackled at preparedness stage, which I think is good, and return to that shortly. Ken, may I ask you two questions, please? So you mentioned that you have 10 regulators in China, right? So this plays to the point around breach notification being a complex issue. So it's difficult enough if you're dealing with a breach with 5, 10, 50 jurisdictions, it's difficult enough if you have one regulator in every country. 10 regulators in China with a relatively new regime, and if I may say so, a legal regime that most lawyers in the West consider to be a bit exotic. We don't fully understand it. We're not able to figure it out. How do you manage this in practice? How can you tell very quickly, if I come to you on a Saturday morning and say, client has a breach, we hear there's 24-hour notification requirements, whom do we need to notify? What are the practical things that we can do in advance in order to be ready for this in China?
Yeah, thanks, Anton. That's a very practical question is in China. So normally there is a tip. The quick tip is there are always a two kind of authority you should go to make the notification. One is the very powerful authority in China, CAC, Cyberspace Administration of China. That is the general is the regulator in charge of cybersecurity and data protection. That's the top regulator. And secondly, depend on which sector your company belong to. For example, if you belong to the automotive, so maybe go to the MIIT, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And even if you had in the healthcare, you maybe go to the Ministry of Health. So normally that is the tip in China. One is to go to the leading regulator, CAC. The other is maybe sector regulator. If the other one want to act, and maybe sometime you go to the local police station, because in China, the police also in charge of the cybersecurity as well. Yeah.
Interesting. That's interesting. We could ask questions around involving the police and law enforcement, because I know it's so different from country to country, but let's not do that. Let's turn to something more, a kind of bigger picture, more strategic. Alison, Robin, I'll come to you first. So let's forget for a moment about the law, but this regulatory complexity, right? So when you're dealing with a truly global breach, let's say 30 plus jurisdictions, and each of them, it's global, each of them has different legal requirements, different culture, social, political, legal, different languages, even different notification forms, everything can be different. My question to you is, when we think about global incident response, are really these differences, especially differences in local legal and regulatory requirements, are these really such an issue in practice, or in the end is 90% of what we have to do in incident response more or less the same, We just need to present it in different ways and in different languages around the world. What are your thoughts, please?
Gosh, that's a very good question, actually. I do think that it's not, they're all the same and 90% is the same. For example, traditionally in Australia, there's been very much an approach of, the focus of incident response rightly and necessarily needs to be on actually mitigating the risk of serious harm first. Do that first, focus on that first, and then the notification to the regulator is very much a poor cousin to that. Of course, you have to do it in certain circumstances, but it shouldn't be the primary focus. It should all be about minimising the risk of harm. And so, I do think, there's sometimes this over focus on, the deadline that you have to notify, and an under focus on, actually what can we do to actually stem the tide of harm. And so, and that I think drives a lot of behaviour when it comes to actually responding to the incident. So I wouldn't be so bold as to say that, 90% of it's all the same. It is maybe if you're just talking about that piece of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Robin. Interesting insight, and I very much like your point around, let's not get too hung up on this short time notification thing, because in some countries, in the UK, for example, you can stop and across the EU, you can stop the notification clock by simply telling them, I had a breach, I don't know what I'm dealing with, I'm looking into it, I'm going to come back to you, maybe provide some basic information. Alison, anything further to add on that point? So I know you've done breaches that go up to 70 countries, I think, or whatever your latest record is, but is there logic in what I'm saying that, much of the fact find, much of what you need to do, much of what you need to establish is basically the same, but then you just need to manage the notification space in the right way?
I've stopped counting how many millions of people, how many breaches, how many countries. I had a breach once that involved Antarctica, which was new to me. I think that was mostly how people filled out their forms, though.
Who do you notify in Antarctica? Is it the penguins?
I mean, yes, I was looking for penguins and, polar bears, I guess. But the core facts remain the same. What happened? What data was affected? Which individuals were affected? Was it acquisition? Was it access? Was it exposure? And how are you going to make sure that this never happens again? Everybody wants to know the core facts. How those are addressed, what you're legally required to disclose, that may vary. In the US, I frequently call them the date states and the non-date states. When did you discover the breach? When did you discover the facts that led to the breach? When did you discover that an individual in that specific state was affected? Some states require you to disclose that, some states don't. So how you manage those bits of information may affect your litigation risk.
Thank you. So I just want to turn to the survey just for another moment. I think we made the key point that what our clients, are telling us is that basically it's the global piece, including the very complicated breach notification matrix that concerns you the most, and that's 60% of your worries in relation to this piece. What I do find interesting is that in this survey, compared to the one we did earlier today in the APAC region, the percentage of you who said that you're worried also about managing internal stakeholders is twice as high as it was in the APAC region. And I wonder whether this has something to do with corporate culture and how in APAC, in Asia in particular, corporations are a bit more regimented and have internal practices, whereas it looks here like most of us in the Western Hemisphere worry about this. This is the final point we'll cover today, so we'll come to that shortly. But if I may summarize at a high level, what I think is the key takeaway from this topic is that responding to incidents can be very challenging and complicated in practice, especially when we're dealing across borders and regions and have to manage multiple notification requirements. So surely preparation must be key in that respect. And on that note, let's move to our third topic, please. Judith, if we can bring up the third survey, please. Thank you. So a third survey, ladies and gentlemen. What is the most important aspect to you or your company of incident preparedness? Is it the incident response plan, identifying critical assets and processes so we can protect them? Is it running tabletop simulations and trainings? Is it raising cyber and data security awareness in the workforce? And apologies, I skipped one. Is it insurance? Is that what's the most important thing? Or finally, is it senior management and board level buy-in? Please tell us what you think, and we'll take it into consideration into the conversation. So, Ken, if I may start with you on this one. So how do we get ready for incidents? What should our clients be doing in that respect? And what should we as their external incident response partners and first port of call should be doing to help them in their preparedness efforts?
So in China, always there is two important aspects. One is that they will have the local instant responses plan. That's very important. As you know, some multinational, they say very GDPR based is instant response plan, but there's no local adaptation. So all the is a senior management does not understand what to do in China. I saw that situation. Secondly, unlike EU and US, the handling the data breach in China is quite at the early stage. Even some senior management, they will have any idea what is the legal consequence of how to handle the data breach in China. So always is to build up the team, and in particular, the ad hoc training in the ones will be also essential. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. Alison, what do you think is the top priority in instant preparedness, or the top priorities?
It's hard to pick just one. I'm going to take the liberty of two. The first being user awareness, training, and education. People make mistakes, whether that's in coding or clicking on links or forwarding, all the company's W-2s in a single PDF to the CEO, right? People make mistakes all the time, but training helps people understand, what to look out for, that they are a target, and also how to avoid being taken advantage of, and just engage in better cyber hygiene. A defense in depth strategy should still be employed though, and that helps make sure that the user isn't the only defense a company has against sophisticated cyber threats. I will say that, it's not if, it's when. And one of the things that I think is core to the response is having clear criteria for when an event becomes an incident, and also when senior leadership and the board needs to be notified. So focusing on that escalation criteria, and then practicing your plan itself through tabletop exercises and simulations is essential to making sure that you're not practicing your response for the first time in a live incident.
Thank you. And actually that was 4 as opposed to 2, but very, very nicely put, Alison. It's not. So no, one thing. Also, I noticed your order of priority pretty much maps the survey, what our clients have told us, which I think is always good. I mean, there's one thing about the survey, both now and in the first session that we've done, that to me comes a bit as a surprise, and maybe we're going to pick up on it shortly, which is how few of us think that tabletops are important. The rehearsing the plan, running the simulations, but let's park that for now. Robin, did you have anything to add on what Ken and Alison told us about the key aspects of incident preparedness?
Yes, just I guess, the subtext of that is obviously prevention is better than cure. So, that's the main part of the most important aspect of incident preparedness. But having that plan and having it being a well-oiled machine in terms of practicing, there's no substitute for that. And, when you're actually thinking about the planning, you need to also include in it, do you have to have retainers already in place, for example, with a communications agency or a PR company, with your forensic IT provider, you've got to have all these things already put into place, and practice how that's going to go, and who should be involved in that. So, I do think, part of it is also horizon scanning. So it's not great to be doing under pressure when there's an actual incident, trying to figure out, who I've got to notify and when and how. It's much better if you've at least identified perhaps in core jurisdictions already, you know, as part of horizon scanning that gets regularly updated and fed into the plan, you know, those sorts of things. So you're not, you know, obtaining that advice at the last minute, you know, or turning your mind to it for the first time at the last minute.
So prepare your breach notification matrix in advance, especially if you're a major multinational, several verticals, and therefore potentially several sectoral regulators as well. That's a very good suggestion, Robin. And if I may continue with you, Robin, and I'll go to Alison and Ken later on. So that's all good, fantastic. So we've fleshed out what we need to be doing. My question is, who should be leading this effort internally? Is it the information security team? Is it legal? Is it IT? Is it all of them together with no clear leadership? What's your experience in Australia? Who tends to lead the incident preparedness effort?
Sure, it varies. You know, I find that most commonly it's led by the legal team, but obviously hand in hand with the IT team. It varies, you know, company specific really, but that's the most common that I see. But, you know, sometimes things get taken out of your hands, you know, as I was mentioning before, sometimes it's the cyber insurers that are actually leading the effort. And so, you know, it just depends on, you know, the stakeholders and how that's arranged, I think, you know, in terms of the incident itself.
But mostly lawyers followed by security, sometimes the insurers in the mix. Alison, what's the view from the US?
So in the US, again, because of privilege concerns and litigation, lawyers lead, but it's hand in glove with the chief information security officer and his or her team. They're going to have the best knowledge of the networks, the data, business continuity plans, and are critical to the response. So I would say the combination of the two, but with direction and oversight by counsel.
Thank you, Alison. And Ken, what's the position in China? Who within the organization tends to lead the initiative to get the organization ready for incidents and breaches?
I think that is a very interesting aspect is in Chinese market. So as you know, it's a lot multinational. Even the domestic they does not have the CISO, does not have Chief Information Security Officer with the organization. So normally will be the DPO, the Data Protection Officer, or the legal team to take the lead. Sometimes also including the compliance team. So which is a DPO or legal, the general counsel take the lead. As I mentioned, in China, we have a number of is the authority. It depends which authority the company will go to first. If it goes to the CAC, because that with the leader regulator, normally it will be the DPO to take the lead. If you go to some specific, is a sectoral, is regulator, because the legal team will be more familiar with that authority that the legal team will take the lead. So it's a case by case basis.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, every time we have I'm so happy we have you on the team, Ken, because every time I learn something, I answer a question about China, I have 10 further questions. But let me ask you one question. What is the position? So many of our clients are a bit, you know, many Western clients are a bit skeptical about submitting to detailed security assessments in China. But if you're there and you have a breach, or if you're a Chinese company, you're going to need forensics, right? And you have all sorts of data export restrictions in China. So my question is, what is the forensics market like in China? Do companies use local organizations? Do they use the big outfits that are global? What is your experience?
So that's also where is an important aspect. Actually, unlike US and EU, the forensic firm in China is not mature. So for multinational, they always go to the headquarters to engage the big four, and also the firm they are used in US or is in Europe. However, the problem is if you engage such international firm, that will encounter the cross-border transfer issue because such firm does not have the server in China. So our practical situation for the client is also when you prepare is a good team, not internal, also external. You at least have the short list. If data breach occur, which forensic firm I will go to first? Should we have a short list? So always is as the legal counsel, we will also provide such suggestions to the client in transit market as well. And maybe in the coming years, there are more local firms can dealing with the forensic for handling the data breach.
Thank you, Ken. So I think we got some really good tangible takeaways from this conversation. If I may, for completeness, so Robin and Alison, so you said in your experience, it varies, of course, from organization, but usually it's driven by legal counsel, and CISO is a very close next, hand in glove. Can you more or less confirm the same with that interesting nuance that in China, it's sometimes the data protection office that leads this? My experience in the UK and Europe, and also working with global organizations, is actually the opposite, right? It's usually led by the security function, but legal is very, very close and very directly involved indeed. Not that it makes a huge difference, but I think it shows interesting difference in culture. So to try to summarize the practical takeaways from this part of the conversation, so I think we've said everyone in the organization has a role to play in incident preparedness. There are certain things that we can do in advance, a lot of things that we can do in advance, but some key things that we should be considering in advance include consider your complicated risk notification metrics before you have a breach. So you have a framework or even a plan if you suffer a serious one. Consider your positions around privilege and disclosability and how you handle this. Involve your external partners in your preparedness efforts. Don't leave them for when a breach happens, but work with your lawyers, work with your PR, work with your forensics. And in China in particular, have a think who is going to be your forensics, because if you go for your usual providers, you also need to think very carefully in advance about the Chinese data export piece among the usual considerations that we deal with in the rest of the world. Thank you, everyone. So on that note, let's move to our fourth and final topic for today. Again, I can see that our chat room is a bit poor in questions and experiences. So if people have experiences to share or questions to ask, please feel free to do so. Judith, if we can bring up our final survey, please. Thank you very much. So for our participants, in your experience, what is the best way to get board level engagement? Is it proactive engagement through regular updates at board meetings? Raise board member awareness and provide training? Frame the issue in board level terms, example, comparisons with peers, how you're faring in the market, what are the necessary improvements, what is the cost, but not on technical or legalistic terms? Is it scaring them into engagement, but telling them what happened to others? Or is it getting external support for increased credibility? Please tell us what you think in the survey. And as our colleagues in the audience are answering the survey, Denton's team, and Alison, I'll start with you if that's okay. Why is the C Executive Suite, the CEO and the board, why is their buy-in and backing so important? What are the respective roles, both at preparedness stage and also when we're dealing with a serious breach?
Of course. So certainly the C-suite is responsible for the day-to-day management and the overall direction of the company, with the board providing strategic oversight of the company's operations and working with management in a collaborative way. One of the things that can be essential as part of planning is to clearly identify what functions management is going to be responsible for, when the boards will be informed versus consulted, what sorts of things they need to approve specifically. And in terms of getting stakeholder engagement, one of the presentations that I do very often that has a pretty powerful effect is delivering a presentation for directors on personal liability for cybersecurity oversight. What we've seen in terms of shareholder derivative liability, also what we're seeing from regulators regarding their expectations, whether that's in banking, healthcare, or other types of industries. It's been a very hot topic for the last couple of years.
So cool head and a solid board level business case with a good dose of scare tactics for good measure, especially when it comes around personal liability. Thank you, Alison. Robin, what are your thoughts on this? And also, can we also start moving into how do we do it? How do we engage with the board?
Sure. I agree. I think fear does work. But, I do think, just reflecting on the first survey result about, what are the key concerns being reputation and brand impact, I don't find it's difficult anymore to, get stakeholder engagement at very senior levels in the organisations. I think directors well understand the risk, especially with class actions occurring now and personal liability being a possibility. The other thing that's occurring is, like in Australia, we've had a couple of very, very high profile data breaches. I don't think we've got the data breach fatigue that you saw in other, you sometimes see in the other jurisdictions. So they're still getting a lot of publicity. And they're also seeing then, how peers in your own sector who've been breached are managing things, and, whether they're managing them well and therefore getting some kudos for, okay, yes, you had a breach, but you've managed that very well, or whether they're managing it poorly and therefore there's an exponential impact on the brand and the reputation of the company. And that is certainly getting the attention at senior levels of the board. And that peer pressure on, companies want to be seen to be good at this area.
Yeah, I think, it's very difficult to say that suffering a serious incident is a good thing and it's an opportunity, right? But it's a crisis. And like with every crisis, there is an opportunity somewhere in that. Because I think one of the key things that, sort of these kind of empirical impressions that you have about something as complex like this is that, generally the way you deal with breaches ultimately determines how it will be remembered, certainly in a PR sense and a customer and brand protection sense, but also sometimes in terms of your legal liability and regulatory exposure. Regulators are human beings. They implement the law, but they also take into account the pulse of public opinion when they're considering whether they're going to impose a fine or not. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Ken, you mentioned earlier that in China, in particular, boards are not as educated as we would have thought when it comes to cyber breaches and preparedness. So same question to you, Ken. Why is that a big problem in China, and why are the boards so important? And how do you engage with the board in relation to cyber in China?
Sure. I think, again, because handling the data breach is quite at the early stage of practice in Chinese market. So the senior management does not have so many ideas compared with the Western country. So normally we want to educate the board. So we share the similar approach. One is provide the fear. So because in China we also have the personal liability. Even in specific situation, we have the criminal sanction. So when the board is always heard of a criminal sanction, they definitely will retain more attention. Secondly, we use some we call headline. Headline case is trigger is training, like DD case, and maybe it's one of the leading company is have such as data breach. The board definitely is the awareness could be different. And finally, is also just you mentioned, you can see the poll is comparison or benchmarking with their peer. They often can say what we are doing, our peer, our supplier doing. So if they don't want to have the feeling to get behind, they want to keep the appraise. So that's also very good tip to engage with the board to let them understand how important to handling the data breach for the business operation. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, team, for the insights. I mean, I'm looking at the survey, and I think big picture it's consistent with what we're saying. So cool heads, engage with your board in a rational way, explain to them the issue. The first thing, which is interesting, because the first survey we did in the first session, the other way around, is keeping it on the agenda, regular updates, make sure it's there, and they keep thinking about it. seems to be the number one at almost 40%, followed by relatively closely frame it in their own terms. So basically what this tells us is the key thing to do takes you 70% up to tackling the issue is explain it to them in rational terms, keep it on the agenda. And there is a dose of scare tactics in there, but it's probably less than what we, the lawyers, or the lawyers at Dentons think. You know, maybe we think the scare element of the solution is bigger, which I think is interesting. All right, thank you very much. That was our fourth topic. I would like to summarize it, but perhaps in the interest of time, we can do it while refreshing also memory about the takeaways in the other three topics. So Niamh, if we can bring up our final slide. So starting with the last topic first, stakeholder engagement. The involvement of the C-suite and the board is absolutely essential. You know, we need clear lines of accountability. We need their banking. We need them to get behind this and enable us to do what we have to do, both in preparedness and incident response. But the way to engage with them is in a rational, calm way, using language that they understand, as opposed to flooding them in technical terms and legalese, and keeping it on the agenda. So this is really important. And then again, to briefly summarize the other topics that we discussed, risk, incident response is absolutely essential. How we deal with incidents is crucial, and responding to incidents can be really challenging, especially in the context of global breaches, especially taking into account the complexity of the global breach notification framework. So what do we do about this? We think about it in advance. We consider the particular risks of our organization. Some key themes that came out from the discussion of the Dentons team and also the survey are that prevention and good defenses is probably the best cure. It's not going to be a panacea. We will be breached at some point. And in order to be able to deal with that when it happens, we need to have our plan, which is reviewed regularly, and after breaches, we need to be testing it. And of course, crucial is the workforce awareness. Everyone has a role to play in this. And in that effort, we need to be also involving our extended incident response team, as it were, our trusted partners, such as our lawyers and forensics service providers, with particular difficulties in certain parts of the world. So on that note, this group was not particularly vocal in terms of comments and questions in the chat room. So if any of our colleagues in the audience have any comments or questions that they would like to raise, we have 5 minutes. So if you have something that you want to share or a question to ask, please unmute and ask, raise your hand or put it in the chat room. If not,
can I just mention a question that's been asked, which is, you know, do you think that ransomware, ransom demands should be paid, you know, in a ransomware attack? You know, it's a query whether it's even lawful to pay it, but, you know, what's the thinking on that? Is it okay to pay it? I'd just be interested in people's views on that.
Thank you, Robin. Why don't I go first very, very briefly? It's a really good question. In my opinion, the answer is, and this is what we tell clients in practice, well, there may be circumstances where it may be a good idea to do it. But if you do it, you should do it in a very considered and very thorough way. One of the latest sort of trends that we're seeing in what clients are asking us for in advance is drafting legal policies for making a decision about paying a ransomware. You know, not giving you the answers, but taking you through all the things that you need to consider. In my opinion, 9 out of 10 cases, the answer is simple: don't do it. And don't do it for 3 key reasons. Number one, it's a legal minefield for all sorts of reasons. You may be funding terrorism, you may be breaching all kinds of legislation. Reason number 2, well, you're paying the same people who hacked you and stole your data. What is your level of assurance that they're going to do what they tell you they're going to do? And third, and crucially, it's a bit like painting a big target on your back and saying to the bad guys, hey, I'm a good customer, come again, I'll pay you. So on that basis, in principle, the answer is no. But I'm interested to hear what, Alison, for example, what do you tell your clients in the US?
You know, the advice I think is always evolving, but practice makes perfect. Managing the incident response plan, keeping in touch with insurers, all of that. Security is a journey. It is not a checklist. So continuing to focus on these issues is really of critical importance.
And Ken, very, very quickly, because we have a question.
Sure. I share the same answer is with you. I will tell my client, don't be a good client for the high tech.
Yeah, it's almost beyond law, isn't it? It's common sense. So we do have a question in the chat room. Do you have any advice on using technology to identify personal information that was breached? Example, AI analytics. I guess the answer depends on what exactly is the context, but who in the Dentons team wants to take this?
I can share my experience, but Robin,
Please.
if you have thoughts, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think one of the technologies that I see commonly deployed is the data mapping technology. So there's, I think, very good software out there that enables you to actually identify the data that's breached and, who that's shared with and the supply chain of data, really. So that's quite common to see that.
Alison?
So generally in the US, to identify the individuals that you need to notify, that doesn't have the same requirement for the reviews to be conducted by contract attorneys. And so AI can be hugely helpful in doing that. I'm going to pop into chat the name of one of the companies that leverages artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to identify information likely to be subject to a notification requirement from unstructured data sets. So it's pretty easy to find a social security number or sometimes even driver's license data, but it is really hard to find protected health information, for example. And so programs that have been trained to spot that kind of data of a like nature, and then hopefully also provide you with address data so you can actually notify individuals, really reduce the manpower required to log all of that in. So, certainly there are other providers, but that's one that we've had favorable experiences with.
Thank you, Alison. I love the name Haystack ID. Says it all. I think to give my 2 cents, and conscious that we need to wrap it up because we've come to time. There are established e-discovery solutions out there that we use. I would imagine what Haystack are doing, Alison, is basically e-discovery, AI-powered e-discovery solutions. But then that's the scenario when you have a breach and you have the data internally and you want to scan it. There's also the scenario that your data is in the wild and then you go to your external dark web services provider, forensics, and they will have the ability to search and find it. So with apologies for pushing it at the very end, but I thought we should answer the single question that was asked in the chat room. Niamh, back to you for wrapping it up.
So 30 seconds for me. This was one of our most popular sessions. We would really love to hear what you all thought of it. Pop us a note in the chat or at cxprogram@dentons.com. We have just 2 sessions left in this series. We're switching up the focus a little bit. The first one is on greenwashing on the 18th of April, and the final one for this particular series is on managing your personal brand. So we'd love to see you and your team at those sessions. I want to say a huge thanks to everybody for attending today, and in particular for your engagement along the way with the polls. And then I want to say a very special thanks to our truly global panel, who we had up at crazy hours of the day and night to deliver these sessions. So thank you all very much for putting such energy and enthusiasm and consideration into today's session. That concludes our session for today. Wishing you all a lovely rest of day.